At the court of Versailles, power could be measured in absurd gestures. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing the king his shirt, holding his candle, standing close enough to be seen tying authority to his body. To modern eyes, it looks ridiculous. Grown adults orbiting ritual, vanity inflated into political procedure. But the system worked because everyone understood something brutal. Visibility was survival. You did not merely need status. You needed to be seen having it. A man could lose influence not because he was weak, but because he was insufficiently present inside the theater of power. What mattered was not character in private, but role in public. And if that sounds ancient, decorative, and safely dead, it is only because the costumes changed. The court did not disappear. It became digital. It moved into offices, platforms, feeds, and personal brands. The old bow became the strategic post. The old ceremonial smile became the curated identity. The old dependence on royal attention became dependence on social visibility. The mask was never abolished. It was democratized. So the real question is not whether modern people are fake. That is too shallow. The deeper question is why systems built in the name of freedom keep rewarding performance over reality. Why does modern life make it so costly to be inwardly complex and so profitable to be outwardly legible? Why do people who speak constantly about authenticity spend extraordinary amounts of energy engineering impressions? And why does this feel less like a conscious lie than like an adaptation, almost a survival instinct? Here is where things become dangerous. The mask no longer feels like deception. It feels like competence. It feels like maturity. It feels like knowing how the world works. And once that happens, self-betrayal stops looking like betrayal. Carl Jung offered one of the clearest frameworks for this long before the internet existed. He spoke of the persona, the social face, the role through which you meet the world. The persona is not evil. No society can function without some degree of role-playing. You cannot reveal your entire soul to every stranger, every boss, every institution, but Jung understood that the mask becomes destructive when the person mistakes it for the self. Then the role no longer protects life. It replaces it. The tragedy is subtle. You do not feel fraudulent at first. You feel effective. The world rewards what it can classify. The smoother the role, the fewer collisions. The more polished the image, the less resistance. What most people never realize is that the persona can become so optimized for approval that the inner life begins to look inconvenient even to the person living it. The true self becomes messy inventory, contradictory, slow, embarrassing, difficult to market. And so it is pushed downward, where Jung believed it reappears as shadow. The first mechanism is social proof. Human beings do not only ask what is true, they ask what appears acceptable inside the tribe. At Versailles, etiquette told people how to desire. In mass society, crowds, institutions, and now platforms perform the same function. Solomon Asch's conformity research became famous because it exposed something humiliating. Intelligent people will publicly agree with what is obviously false when the social pressure is strong enough. Not always, not absolutely, but often enough to matter. In the experiment, people conform to wrong judgments about line lengths with disturbing regularity. The point was never that humans are stupid. The point was that belonging often speaks louder than perception. In history, court cultures, party systems, and ideological movements have always exploited this. In modern life, the mechanism is ambient. Trends do not merely show you what others like. They tell you what kinds of selves are currently admissible. You watch what is rewarded, and your nervous system learns the lesson before your intellect does. You begin editing yourself preemptively. The second mechanism is status signaling. Thorstein Veblen wrote about conspicuous display in economics, but the principle goes deeper than consumption. People signal not only wealth but taste, emotional refinement, politics, morality, productivity, and trauma literacy. Every era invents its own badges. In aristocratic courts, it was proximity and ritual fluency. In industrial society, it was respectability. In digital society, it is legibility, the right opinions, the right aesthetics, the right calibrated vulnerability, the right hints of ambition without vulgarity, the right causes without excessive inconvenience. Status has become psychological branding. Historical elites displayed luxury. Modern elites display interpretation. They show that they know how to read the room, how to say the sanctioned thing with the right amount of irony. But the story gets darker. Status signaling does not just distort what you show, it slowly distorts what you want. People begin to desire experiences because those experiences produce useful identity evidence. Travel becomes proof of cosmopolitanism. Reading becomes proof of depth. Relationships become proof of being lovable. Even suffering becomes proof of complexity. The third mechanism is the halo effect. Once an image is accepted as admirable, the mind starts granting it moral credit it has not earned. Attractive people are assumed to be more intelligent. Confident people are assumed to be more competent. Polished identities are assumed to be more truthful. This matters because the modern mask is not only about hiding ugliness. It is about borrowing goodness from presentation. In politics, the well-spoken can appear sincere while saying nothing. In work culture, the visibly organized can appear indispensable while producing little of substance. In personal life, someone who performs emotional vocabulary can appear deep while remaining strategically unavailable. Historically, uniforms, titles, and manners produced halos. Today, visual design, rhetorical fluency, and algorithmic popularity do the same. Once the halo forms, people stop investigating. The appearance of coherence substitutes for evidence of character. And because people know this intuitively, they invest in coherence more than truth. Not because they are monsters, but because they are adapting to a world in which first impressions have become infrastructure. The fourth mechanism is cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger and James Carl Smith showed something deeply uncomfortable. When people act against their private reality, they often do not simply feel hypocritical. They begin adjusting their beliefs to reduce the tension. That is one of the hidden costs of performance. If you repeatedly present a version of yourself that is more confident, more moral, more healed, more certain, or more ambitious than you actually are, the strain becomes difficult to bear. One path is honesty. The other is internal revision. You begin rationalizing the gap. You tell yourself you are not pretending, only manifesting, not posturing, only positioning, not suppressing doubt, only protecting energy. Sometimes those explanations are partly true. But dissonance has a corrosive genius. It can convert strategic display into self-narrative. A person does not wake up one morning and declare, "I will abandon my inner life." It happens through many tiny reconciliations. Each compromise asks for a story, and the mind dutifully supplies one. The fifth mechanism is projection, and this is where Jung's shadow returns. The parts of yourself that do not fit the approved image do not vanish. They become foreign territory. What you refuse to admit in yourself becomes intolerable in others. The highly performative person may become obsessed with calling everyone else fake. The relentlessly agreeable person may secretly hunger for cruelty and contempt. The person building a public identity around purity may experience forbidden envy, domination, or erotic chaos beneath the surface. History is full of moral systems that preached restraint while generating hidden decadence. Court piety often concealed rivalry. Respectability culture concealed appetite. Revolutionary virtue concealed bloodlust. Modern identity culture is no different. The more aggressively people market transparency, the more suspicious you should become of what had to be amputated to keep that image stable. The shadow is not merely a storehouse of evil. It is a graveyard of disowned life. The sixth mechanism is self-surveillance. Michel Foucault describes societies in which people internalize the gaze of authority, but the modern version is more intimate. You no longer need a king, prison guard, or priest constantly watching. You become your own editor, your own censor, your own publicist. Before speaking, you test the sentence against invisible audiences. Before feeling, you translate the feeling into acceptable language. Before acting, you anticipate how the act could be interpreted by employers, friends, strangers, future collaborators, or some abstract moral market that never fully sleeps. This is one reason modern exhaustion feels different from old-fashioned repression. It is participatory. The person policing you often looks like you. And because platforms are structured around visibility, the self becomes a project under continuous revision. Even rest becomes content logic. Even silence becomes a strategic absence. Even rebellion can become branding. There is almost no experience the system cannot metabolize into identity currency. Historical societies built masks around rank. Modern societies build them around adaptability. That sounds more humane, but it can be more invasive. Rank was at least visibly external. Adaptability enters the psyche. In the workplace, people speak about alignment, executive presence, and cultural fit as if these are neutral virtues. Sometimes they are. Often they are euphemisms for emotional formatting. Learn how to sound energetic without sounding needy, confident without threatening, original without eccentricity, political without risk, warm without permeability, intelligent without making anyone feel small. This is not simple professionalism. It is aesthetic obedience. Relationships suffer too. People increasingly approach intimacy with the same logic they bring to presentation: manage perception, maximize optionality, avoid revealing needs that could weaken bargaining position. The result is a peculiar hunger. People want to be known, but only after being approved. They want intimacy, but only if it does not disrupt image. Now connect this to digital culture and the picture becomes sharper. Social media did not invent vanity, conformity, or status games. It industrialized them. It converted attention into a continuous market signal. It made comparison ambient and metrics visible. A post is no longer just expression. It is a small referendum. Over time, people do not simply share what they love. They learn to love what performs. Even outrage becomes quantifiable. Even grief becomes stylized. What most people never realize is that the algorithm does not need to force you into a false self. It only needs to reward whichever part of you is most repeatable. The self gets trimmed for efficiency. Nuance is expensive. Contradiction is expensive. Slow transformation is expensive. A brand cannot metabolize mystery, but a mask can. And because modern visibility is tied to opportunity, people experience this not as corruption but as realism. They say, "This is just how the game works." That sentence has justified more spiritual damage than open tyranny ever could. And this changes everything because the deepest issue is not performance, it is dependency. A person can wear a role lightly and remain inwardly alive. The real catastrophe begins when the role becomes the only self that still receives social oxygen. Then authenticity stops feeling liberating and starts feeling economically, romantically, or professionally dangerous. People remain in jobs, relationships, communities, and identities not because they believe in them, but because the performed self built there has become their only functioning passport. Here is the surprising twist. Many people do not cling to masks because they are proud of them. They cling to them because they no longer know what would remain without them. The performance started as strategy and became architecture. Remove it too quickly and the person does not feel free. The person feels blank. This is why endless advice about just be yourself fails. Which self? The exhausted self shaped by approval, the disowned self buried under years of adaptation, the shadow self charged with resentment, the frightened self that learned early that sincerity invites punishment. Authenticity is not a slogan. It is a confrontation. It means discovering how much of your identity was assembled for witness rather than truth. It means noticing which values collapse when applause disappears. It means admitting that some of your most polished traits may be elegant defenses against exposure. Jung's insight was not that the mask should be destroyed. It was that it should become transparent to the person wearing it. A flexible instrument, not a prison. A role, not a religion. Artificial intelligence adds a final layer to this problem. As generative systems learn to optimize resumes, profiles, bios, cover letters, flirtation, branding, even empathy itself, the usable self becomes easier to manufacture and harder to distrust. When machines can help people compose the correct version of themselves at scale, the pressure to remain inwardly uncurated grows even weaker. Society may soon reward not merely performance, but seamless synthetic performance. That does not mean truth disappears. It means truth comes less competitive. More people will sound insightful. More people will appear coherent. More people will learn to simulate depth before they have suffered enough to possess it. The mask will get smarter. The shadow will get hungrier. So the final question is not whether you are performing. You are. Everyone is, in some degree. The real question is whether the role still serves a living center or whether the center has been hollowed out and replaced by a persona built for circulation. A society can survive vanity. It can survive ambition. It can even survive hypocrisy for a long time. What it cannot survive indefinitely is a population that becomes unreadable to itself. People so adapted to external recognition that they lose contact with private conviction. The most frightening part is not that the mask is false. The most frightening part is that, if it works well enough, you may begin to call it your face.